She whispered her discomfort mid-flight, not knowing the man beside her wasn't just a passenger, but the one who owned the skies. One quiet act of racism triggers a national firestorm. But this time, the story doesn't end with humiliation. It begins with reckoning. He said nothing when they asked him to leave. But when he returned, he wasn't holding a boarding pass. He was holding power, and the whole world was about to watch what happens when a giant stands up without ever raising his voice. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. It was a golden morning at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, the kind that wrapped the tarmac in warmth and painted the skies with streaks of mellow sunlight. Travelers bustled with phones in hand and coffee cups tipping over their luggage handles. Among them, seated quietly in the corner near Gate 12, was Shaquille O'Neal. Not the superstar with a mic and a championship ring, but the man beneath all of that. He wore a navy hoodie, weathered jeans, sneakers scuffed at the toes. He had no entourage, no cameras, no one asking for autographs, and that was how he liked it. Once a year, Shaq flew commercial. No press, no corporate security detail, just him and the people. It was his ritual, not for the sake of nostalgia, but to remind himself what humility felt like, what everyday humanity looked like. It grounded him, especially now that his empire stretched beyond basketball, into media, philanthropy, and most recently, aviation. No one in that terminal knew the quiet man, with broad shoulders sipping ginger tea in the corner, was the majority owner of Eversky Airlines. He smiled at a little boy dragging a Spider-Man backpack twice his size. When the child's crayons scattered across the floor, Shaq was the first to kneel and help him pick them up. The mother offered a quick thank you and scurried off, her eyes lingering just long enough to register something about the man, his size, his calm, maybe even the familiar kindness in his eyes. The airport, like any theater of transit, was alive with invisible stories. But in Gate 12, something different simmered. A shift in the air, a disturbance that had no name yet. Christine Mallory stepped into the gate area, as if she owned it, blazer pressed, lips thin and coated in plum lipstick, and her carry-on gleaming like it had never touched asphalt. She moved through the space, like a silent executive checking the world for alignment. Her silver bracelet glinted as she raised her hand to adjust her designer sunglasses. It bore the word legacy, etched deep into the metal, a gift from her husband Franklin, now seated on the board of directors at Eversky. She paused as she scanned the room, and her gaze landed, not on the gate monitor, not on the boarding desk, but on him. Shaq. A flicker passed through her expression. Not quite fear, not quite suspicion, but something colder, subtler. The type of thing that people like Christine didn't speak out loud. The thing they buried beneath words like preference and comfort. She squinted, lips pursed, and adjusted the strap of her bag, stepping farther away from where he sat, even though she hadn't even been close. Shaq felt it. Not the way a man notices when he's being watched, but the way a man senses the weather's about to turn. He didn't look up. He just breathed, in, out. He knew the type, knew how these moments unfolded. He'd learned long ago that battles often arrived without shouting, without fists, that the most dangerous thing in a room was not always aggression, but assumption. Gate 12's overhead speaker chimed. Now boarding Group A for Flight 704 to Washington, D.C. Please have your boarding passes ready. Shaq stood slowly, grabbing his modest backpack. He waited for families with children to board first. He didn't cut in line, didn't rush forward despite his first-class pass. A few heads turned. One young woman leaned over to her partner and whispered, "Is that?" But the moment passed. Shaq walked forward, dipped his head politely at the attendant, and stepped into the jet bridge. Christine boarded just after him, face neutral, eyes alert. When she arrived at row 2, the first-class row, her posture changed. Her gaze flicked to the seat next to hers. There he was again. Shaquille O'Neal, large, quiet, unassuming. She hesitated, then approached the flight attendant. "Excuse me," she said with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Is it possible to have this seat changed? I don't mean to be difficult, but I get very claustrophobic, and I'd feel more comfortable next to someone, less physically imposing." The attendant, a young man named Todd, blinked. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we're fully booked in first class. I can check economy." Christine cut him off with a gentle but firm, "That won't do. I have a spinal condition. I need first. I'm sure there's a way. Maybe an accommodation policy." Todd hesitated. Shaq had already buckled in, eyes closed, headphones on. He hadn't said a word, but Christine leaned in, lowering her voice. It's not that I don't trust him. It's just, I travel often, and I know when I'm uncomfortable. I don't want this to become something escalated after takeoff. I've seen these things go wrong. Her tone was syrupy sweet, but the undertone was sharp. Todd offered a tight nod and said he'd speak with the captain. Christine took her seat. Reluctantly. Her movements stiff, her body tilted slightly away from Shaq. Every so often she glanced at him. Not with fear, but with calculation, as if she were mentally documenting something, preparing a story before anything had even happened. Shaq opened his eyes briefly. No eye contact. Just enough to see the way she leaned, the way her fingers tapped her tray table rhythmically. A subtle tick of agitation. He breathed in again. He had hoped this trip would be smooth, reflective, but he knew now, something was coming, and it would not be fair. It would not be honest. The aircraft taxied down the runway, wheels lifting slowly into the sky. As the plane ascended over Georgia, Christine pulled out a tablet and began typing a message. The screen reflected faintly off her glasses. Flying next to someone who's making me nervous. He hasn't said anything, but I feel unsafe. I need this on record. The email was addressed to a contact named F. Mallory. Board internal. Next to her, Shaq leaned back, closed his eyes again, and pretended not to notice. But the thing about giants, real giants, is that they don't need to react to pressure. They wait for the ground to shift beneath others first. At 38,000 feet, high above the world, Christine Mallory believed she was in control. What she didn't know was that the man next to her wasn't just a passenger. He was the architect of the very skies she soared through. And fate, still silent, had just begun to write its next chapter. Shaq settled into his seat with the practiced ease of a man who'd traveled through the skies often enough to know that stillness held more power than display. The seat beside the window fit his frame just enough to be comfortable. First class had its small mercies, even if it hadn't been designed with 7-foot giants in mind. He tucked his long legs, adjusted his hoodie, and exhaled slowly. To most on board, he was just another passenger. To those who recognized him, he was the familiar figure of greatness wrapped in humility. He wasn't there to impress. He was there to disappear. Minutes later, Christine Mallory stepped into the cabin. Her eyes scanned the plush aisle with silent expectation. Her walk was deliberate, shoes clicking softly against the flooring. Not hurried, but entitled. The moment she spotted her assigned seat, her entire body visibly paused. She tilted her head and stared. There he was again, Shaquille O'Neal. Even seated, his presence filled the row. He looked serene, eyes closed, head leaned against the curved wall of the plane. But Christine's breath hitched. Her eyes darted to Todd, the flight attendant, who was finishing a safety demonstration just a few feet ahead. She approached him without urgency, but with a familiar tone of condescension laced in sugar. "Excuse me," she said softly, placing a manicured hand gently on Todd's forearm. "I hate to be that person. I really do, but I'm not feeling comfortable in my assigned seat." Todd blinked, instinctively glancing at the manifest in his hand, then at the aisle. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Everything all right? It's just, the gentleman seated next to me," she said with a small, careful smile. "He's very large. I have a mild anxiety disorder, claustrophobia to be exact, and I worry I won't feel safe or relaxed sitting next to someone that imposing." Todd hesitated. Christine's voice wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive, but her words carried the type of coded alarm that forced people to make hard decisions quickly. She wasn't accusing Shaq of doing anything wrong, not directly, but her phrasing, her tone, it placed the burden of correction on the airline. "I understand," Todd said cautiously. "Unfortunately, first class is full. I can check the rear cabin, though. See if there's a row you can have to yourself." Christine stiffened slightly, then gave a small, practiced laugh. "Oh, I'm not asking to be punished," she said, almost jokingly. "I paid for first class. I'm just saying, I feel genuinely uneasy. These things escalate sometimes. You've seen the news. I'd rather we be proactive than reactive." Todd didn't know what to say. He glanced down the aisle. The other attendants were occupied. The captain hadn't been alerted. It was an awkward standoff without noise. Christine's smile didn't falter, but her posture shifted, leaning slightly into expectation, into quiet pressure. Passengers in surrounding rows were beginning to notice. Whispers were exchanged in murmurs. A few eyes flicked toward Shaq. He hadn't moved. Not once. Headphones in, eyes closed. But somehow, without speaking, without standing, he was now the center of a conflict he hadn't created. Todd walked away for a moment, murmuring into his radio. Christine sat down, arms crossed tightly across her chest, gaze fixed out the opposite window, as far from Shaq as she could look. Her mouth was a thin line. The silver bracelet on her wrist caught the cabin light. Shaq finally opened his eyes. He looked down at his hands, then at the slow-moving cabin. He could feel the heat of suspicion. Though no one had said anything overt, it was there, in the glances, in the quiet, in the way Todd avoided his gaze when he returned. "We'll be departing shortly," Todd said, eyes on Christine but voice projecting outward. "Everyone's been checked in and cleared." Christine's response was a barely concealed sigh. She tapped her nails against the armrest in a slow rhythm, one that wasn't anxious so much as rehearsed. There was no protest from her, but there didn't need to be. As the plane rolled back from the gate, a woman a few rows back took out her phone. She angled it toward the front rows, almost casually. No one noticed. Not really. But she kept it filming quietly. She'd seen enough news stories to know when something didn't sit right. The plane took off. Tension hovered in the cabin like a second atmosphere. No one said anything, but the awkwardness was a living thing, stretching across rows and overhead compartments. Todd made himself scarce. The service cart was delayed. Christine's discomfort grew more visible. Though she spoke not a word, she clutched the seat's edge and leaned as far away from Shaq as possible. Shaq sat still, his breathing slow, his thoughts louder than any turbulence outside. He'd dealt with this before, not just the glances, but the passive framing, the way someone's discomfort could be weaponized as proof. He'd always known that in certain spaces, presence could be read as threat. He looked out the window. A sea of clouds stretched below. The vast, unending sky silent, untouchable. He found peace there, as he always did. Midway through the flight, Todd approached Shaq. He bent down slightly, lowered his voice. "Mr. O'Neill, I hope everything's all right." Shaq turned slowly to meet his eyes. "Is it not?" Todd hesitated again, like he was caught between duty and doubt. "Just, we've had a concern expressed. Nothing specific. Just, passenger anxiety, standard stuff." Shaq didn't respond right away. Then he nodded, slowly. "I'm good, man." Todd gave a tight smile, then walked away. The message was vague, but the meaning was clear. Christine had planted the seed, and now it had begun to sprout. It wasn't about safety, it was about perception. And perception, in high places, had a tendency to morph into truth. Shaq leaned back once more, folding his hands over his chest. The whisper had started. Not loud enough to be called out, not sharp enough to be named, but it was moving, unchecked. Soft racism dressed in silk gloves. The young woman with the phone kept filming. By the time the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their descent into Washington, D.C., the temperature in the cabin had shifted. Not the air, but the people. A murmur here, a glance there, a growing question that had no voice yet. What happened between them? As the wheels touched down, Todd returned. "We'd like to speak with you briefly once we land," he said to Shaq. "Nothing serious. Just clarification." Shaq didn't flinch. "Of course." Christine sat upright, suddenly calmer. Her lips curled faintly at the corners. She didn't speak, didn't gloat, but her silence was saturated with satisfaction. She had set something in motion. A shift that no one could see but everyone would feel. The plane coasted to the gate. The engines shut down. Doors hissed open. Shaq waited. Let the others deboard first. The woman with the camera slipped off quietly, unnoticed. When Shaq finally stood, the aisle seemed to narrow. Todd waited with a second attendant near the galley. Christine didn't look back, as she left. She didn't have to. Shaq nodded once, following the crew wordlessly. He wasn't angry, not yet, but something in him had settled deeper. Not resentment, not rage, just readiness. Because the storm had whispered its arrival. And he had heard it, loud and clear. At cruising altitude, silence carried a weight different than on the ground. The hum of the engines masked the hush of watchful eyes. Shaq remained composed in his seat, a still figure among shifting discomfort. He wasn't moving, he wasn't speaking. Yet, it was clear, His very presence had been turned into a problem. Christine had kept her performance subtle. She'd shifted in her seat just enough to look unsettled, occasionally pressing her hand to her chest like her breathing was shallow. At one point she reached up and called for Todd. He approached, crouched discreetly beside her, but her voice, no matter how quiet, carried in the compressed silence of the cabin. "I'm sorry," she whispered, brows furrowed in mock distress. I just don't feel safe. He hasn't said anything, I know, but it's just a feeling. He's been staring at me. I'm having an anxiety episode." Todd glanced at Shaq. He was looking out the window, hands folded, unmoved. Todd's instincts warred inside him. There was no threat, no raised voice, no complaint from the man himself. But Christine was visibly distressed, or performing it convincingly enough. Her position as a frequent flyer, a known elite passenger, registered in his mind. He dealt with unreasonable requests before, but this one was different. This one had potential headlines lurking in its folds. "I'll speak to the captain," Todd said, his voice low. Christine offered a tight nod and dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Her hands didn't tremble. Todd stepped into the galley, where the captain was seated with a tablet. He explained the situation with careful language, tiptoeing between policy and intuition. "We don't have any direct complaints, just an emotional response. She's uneasy. We've got this very high-profile passenger, and a very visible one. I don't want this to blow up." The captain exhaled, leaning back in his seat. "So we're making decisions off feelings now?" he asked. Todd didn't answer. The question lingered unanswered. Moments later, Todd returned to Shaq's row. He bent slightly, keeping his voice even and discreet. "Mr. O'Neill, would you mind joining me in the galley for a quick conversation?" Shaq didn't flinch. He didn't ask why. He simply unbuckled his belt, stood with deliberate calm, and followed Todd to the rear. The cabin eyes followed him like shadows. He was used to being watched, but this wasn't fame. This was judgment. In the galley, Todd cleared his throat, trying not to meet Shaq's eyes too long. "I know this is awkward," he began, "but there's been concern expressed. No accusations, just discomfort. The captain's wondering, would you be willing to deboard after we land? Let us sort this out on the ground." Shaq looked at him for a long time. Not with anger, not even disappointment, just clarity. "Am I being accused of anything?" he asked softly. "No, sir, not formally. It's just," Shaq nodded once, cutting off the sentence. "You want the pressure off up here," he said. "So you want to move the problem off the plane." Todd froze. "It's not that we think you're the problem. But you know I'm not Christine Mallory," Shaq said, almost under his breath. Todd looked down. "I'll walk off," Shaq said, "when we land. No argument. But I want to be clear, I'm doing this because I can carry what this moment weighs. Don't mistake that for agreement." Todd murmured something close to a thank you, but it didn't carry weight. Back in his seat, Shaq leaned his head against the cabin wall. He didn't close his eyes this time. He stared out over the horizon, pale blue above thick clouds. He wondered how many times people like Christine had rewritten history with nothing more than discomfort. How many men had lost careers, credibility, or dignity, because someone powerful decided their presence was too much. Christine caught his eye briefly. She didn't look smug, just satisfied, like someone who had tested the limits of control and found them pleasing. She believed she had handled a situation before it became one. The pilot's voice crackled through the speaker system, announcing their final descent. Christine smoothed her blouse, touched up her lipstick. She didn't glance Shaq's way again. She didn't need to. The landing was smooth, mechanical, efficient. Passengers unbuckled with the usual rustle. Overhead bins creaked open. But in row 2 the movements were measured, almost ritualistic. Shaq stood and waited. Todd motioned toward the rear exit. The other attendant had coordinated with ground crew. Discreet. They had requested, no scene, just an escort for routine clarification. The passengers began to notice the oddity. A few whispered. One pulled out a phone. Another asked softly, "What did he do?" No one answered, because nothing had been done. But perception had already reshaped the story. Shaq stepped off the plane quietly. Outside, under the jet bridge, a pair of airline security officials waited. Not police, not that kind of escalation. But still, a presence. One held a clipboard, the other had a body cam clipped to his vest. They didn't speak to him as he passed. They didn't need to. Christine stepped off 5 minutes later, greeted by a luxury car arranged through her VIP status. She smiled and spoke into her phone. Yes, all sorted. Just a minor issue. You know how things are these days. At the same time, halfway across the arrivals terminal, a teenager who had watched everything unfold was uploading the video. She didn't tag anyone. She didn't need to. The captions spoke volume. Woman complains about black man for just existing. Turns out it's Shaquille O'Neal. Within the hour, it hit Twitter. 2 hours later, it trended nationwide. By nightfall, it would be on cable news. Shaq sat in a quiet private lounge. Eversky maintained for executives. Not even the manager knew he owned the company now. He watched the video in silence. Saw Christine's expression. Heard her coded words. She's not afraid of me, he said aloud to no one. She's afraid of who she can't control. He didn't call a lawyer. Didn't post a rebuttal. He just waited. Because power, real power, didn't scream. It listened. It watched. And then it decided. The sun rose quietly over the East Coast, but the internet wasn't sleeping. By 6:45 a.m., 2 hashtags had already climbed the ranks of trending topics nationwide: mold, plain privilege, and Shaq thrown off. Within an hour they exploded across platforms, filling feeds with disbelief, anger, and that uniquely American blend of digital outrage and investigative curiosity. Something had happened in the skies, and this time it wasn't turbulence or delays. It was the unraveling of a story that hit nerves far deeper. The video wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. Captured with the shaky calm of a teenager too wise for her age, it showed Christine Mallory, leaning toward the flight attendant, whispering in a voice she clearly thought would never be heard. He's not like us. I just don't feel safe. The camera didn't zoom. It didn't catch everything. But it caught enough. Shaq, silent, still, unaware. The attendant, nodding uncomfortably, the tone of the whisper, insidious in its familiarity. The quiet kind of racism. The type that wears pearls and uses phrases like "I have concerns." By mid-morning, news sites picked it up. TMZ led with Shaquille O'Neal kicked off flight after woman felt unsafe. Racism or misunderstanding. HuffPost ran a sharper headline: "The privilege of discomfort, when black presence becomes a threat." And then there was the video itself, re-uploaded, reposted, remixed with slow zooms and text overlays. TikTok creators broke it down frame by frame. Twitter sleuths uncovered the name Christine Mallory within hours. That name opened doors. Christine was not a random passenger. She was the wife of Franklin Mallory, a longtime senior board member of Eversky Airlines, a man known in closed circles for his ability to steer conversations and silence controversies before they reached media cycles. Their family's wealth was deep-rooted, legacy old, not new, the kind that donated buildings, not just checks. But Christine wasn't answering questions. No statements, no posts. Her social media accounts were quickly locked. Reporters arrived at their gated property in Connecticut to find no comment signs answered by intercom. She had vanished behind layers of silence and privilege. Meanwhile, Shaq said nothing. No tweets, no interviews, no rebuttals. He watched the internet spiral from his suite in D.C., dressed in a gray hoodie, his phone vibrating with media requests every 10 minutes. He'd muted them all. Across the room, the Eversky corporate team scrambled in real time, not because of the racism accusation, but because the airline stock had dropped 3.2% by noon. Investors wanted reassurance. Board members demanded calm. What they didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that the man they had quietly brought on as an anonymous stakeholder, nearly a year ago, the celebrity investor they had thought would be good PR fodder and silent capital, now owned 51% of Eversky Airlines. Shaquille O'Neal, through a blind trust in a web of shell entities, had become the company's majority shareholder. It was a strategic move, born not out of vengeance, but vision, a long game. He believed in air travel, believed in access, believed in changing culture from within. And now that belief had run straight into the teeth of injustice. He hadn't wanted attention. He hadn't wanted headlines. But the world had different plans. As the day unfolded, America split into its usual camps. Some claimed Christine was justified, that women have a right to feel safe, and you never know with celebrities these days. Others dragged her name through the mud, posting old photos, speculating on her past, her politics, her history of complaints at schools and clubs, and HOA meetings. Some just mourned the familiarity of it all. A black man removed, not for doing, but for being. Shaq watched quietly. His assistant Janelle paced the room with two phones pressed to her ears, answering media, dodging sponsors, fielding statements from civil rights groups, brand partners, even celebrity friends wanting to show solidarity. "Steven wants to post a joint video with you," she said at one point. "No," Shaq replied. "LeBron says he'll..." "No." She stopped pacing. "You sure you want to play it like this?" Shaq looked up. His eyes weren't angry, just focused. "I'm not playing anything," he said. "I'm watching." Because that's what power does when it's been underestimated. At Eversky's headquarters, the boardroom was chaos. The public relations team had crafted 3 potential statements, each watered down and devoid of real accountability. Franklin Mallory hadn't shown up for the emergency call. He'd sent a representative who insisted Christine was suffering from emotional exhaustion and didn't mean to cause harm. "She has anxiety," the rep offered, like it was an excuse. "No one's talking about Shaq's anxiety," someone muttered from the legal team. But the twist they didn't see coming was already taking shape. In a locked file cabinet in Shaq's hotel suite was a document few had read in full. A contract signed 9 months earlier, transferring voting control of Eversky Airlines to Shaquille O'Neal in the event of major brand risk involving social integrity. It was a clause he had inserted quietly, with no fanfare, because he knew the world hadn't changed as much as it claimed to. And now that clause was active, not because he activated it, but because Christine did. The airline was hemorrhaging goodwill. Staff were speaking out anonymously. A former employee came forward on LinkedIn, saying she'd once heard Christine refer to a crew member as urban aggressive. Passengers were flooding review sites with 1-star stories. "If they can do that to Shaq," one post read, "what would they do to me?" Still, Shaq waited. He wasn't rushing to the mic. He wasn't hungry for revenge. He was making a list. In the silence of his suite, he opened a notepad and began sketching ideas. Airline policy audits, bias response training, passenger behavior protocols, a cultural overhaul. He wasn't here to burn the house down. He was here to rebuild the foundation. By evening, Franklin Mallory finally called. Janelle answered, holding the phone out. "Franklin wants to speak with you directly." Shaq took the call. He didn't say hello. "You've got to understand," Franklin started, his voice trying to sound controlled. Christine was overwhelmed. There was no intention. Shaq cut him off with one line. "She whispered racism at 38,000 feet, and now the whole world can hear it." There was silence. Then Shaq said, "Tell your wife to rest. She'll need it." He hung up. Because this wasn't about a feud. It wasn't even about Christine anymore. It was about visibility. About the quiet kind of injustice that thought it could hide in whispered discomfort and polite policy. But now it had gone viral. And the man at the center of it wasn't broken. He was just getting started. The Eversky headquarters in downtown Los Angeles was designed to feel untouchable. Sleek, towering, all glass and silver edges. The kind of place where silence cost millions and the view did more talking than the people inside. On the 42nd floor, behind a wall of tempered transparency, the executive boardroom buzzed with a tightly wound anxiety that no PR team could smooth over. The airline's stock had dipped another 2.1% overnight. Calls from national advertisers were going unanswered. Employees were leaking internal emails. News outlets were planting roots at the building's entrance. Inside the room, 12 people sat in leather chairs that now felt more like interrogation seats. Franklin Mallory, co-founder and long-serving board patriarch, looked annoyed more than concerned. His tie was loose at the collar, his tone clipped as he dismissed the chaos around him. "This is a social blip," Franklin declared, hands clasped, like a sermon. "Give it 72 hours and the feeds will move on. We've had weather outages that caused more press. People love to rage online. They don't have the patience to sustain outrage, especially not about a misunderstanding." A murmur of disagreement stirred across the table. Some weren't so sure anymore. The shock thrown off fallout hadn't faded. It had intensified. Civil rights groups had issued statements. Athletes and artists were taking sides. The video was now being studied in classrooms and dissected on talk shows. This wasn't fading, it was cementing. "Franklin," said Dana Lang, the CFO, "with respect, this isn't weather or turbulence. This is a racial optics crisis on a flight we control, starring a global icon we humiliated." Franklin scoffed, turning toward the panoramic window. He boarded anonymously. Didn't want attention. And now he's the victim? My wife didn't accuse him of anything. She just asked for space. Your wife whispered coded racism into an attendant's ear, and the world heard it. Dana replied coldly. Now every camera is aimed at us. Before Franklin could bite back, the assistant at the door cleared his throat nervously. He's here. A hush rolled through the room. The door opened. Shaquille O'Neal walked in. Not with swagger, not with fanfare, but with a stillness that quieted even the clattering nerves in the room. He wore black, no logos, no suit, just a fitted jacket, charcoal pants and presence. Everyone knew who he was. But none of them knew why he was there. Not like this. He didn't offer greetings. He didn't shake hands. He walked slowly to the head of the table, where the chair was conspicuously empty. Franklin stood. Shaquille. Appreciate you coming. Look, this whole thing. Shaq raised a hand, calm, slow, not aggressive. The kind of gesture that held more gravity than a speech. He took the chair at the head of the table and sat. Then from his jacket he pulled out a single folder. He placed it flat on the polished oak surface, opened it, and slid a signed document forward. The room shifted. Breath held. Eyes scanned. Franklin's brows drew together. What is this? Shaq leaned back. It's control. Dana reached for the paper and skimmed it, her eyes widening. He activated Clause 9. A sharp inhale filled the air. Several executives exchanged stunned glances. Clause 9 was buried in the contractual fine print, a provision that allowed the company's majority shareholder to take temporary executive control during a period of catastrophic brand risk involving public trust. The assumption had always been that no one outside the founders would ever hold that power. Until now. Franklin stepped forward, voice taut. This is absurd. You're not a board member. You're a celebrity investor. I'm your majority shareholder. Shaq replied without raising his voice. 51% through a trust that your compliance team signed off on. You needed a cash infusion last year. Quiet capital. I gave it, quietly, until now. The room froze. Shaq tapped the folder gently. This clause allows me to make executive decisions during crises involving social integrity. I advised your team to build policy frameworks to prevent incidents like what happened last week. You shelved them. Franklin's face flushed. You think you can waltz in here and… Shaq stood. Not with menace. With purpose. You removed me from a flight because a woman said she didn't feel safe sitting next to someone who looked like me. And then you tried to spin it as policy. But your problem isn't PR. It's culture. And I'm here to change it. He began walking around the table slowly. Let me be very clear, he continued. This isn't about revenge. It's about reckoning. You built this company thinking the sky belonged to people who looked like you. But it belongs to everyone. That seat I took? It's not the only one I'm taking. Dana spoke quietly. What are your intentions, Mr. O'Neal? He stopped near her chair. We're issuing a formal apology. Public not buried in a press release. Christine's behavior will be acknowledged, not denied. We're starting mandatory anti-bias training for all cabin crew and pilots, designed by experts, not your legal team. Every senior staff member will undergo it too, including the board. And what if the board refuses? Franklin asked. Shaq met his eyes. Then the board changes. The air tightened. No one moved. No one challenged him. Not because he was threatening, but because he wasn't bluffing. Shaq returned to his seat. This company has been flying on autopilot for too long. We hit a storm and instead of correcting course you blamed wind. He paused. Hands folded again. Now I'm the captain. Outside the glass walls, the city pulsed with movement, unaware of the shift happening above. But inside that boardroom, everything had changed. Not with a shout, not with a fight, with a signature, with silence, and with the gentle reminder that sometimes giants don't walk in to ask for a seat at the table. They come to be the table. In the weeks that followed Shaq's silent rise to control, the noise outside only grew louder. The headlines hadn't faded. The think pieces hadn't stopped. If anything, the story had morphed into something larger than a flight or a misunderstanding. It had become a mirror, one that forced the country to stare back at itself. And at the center of that mirror now stood Christine Mallory. For days, she'd remained hidden, tucked away in the cold luxury of her Connecticut estate, letting lawyers and PR advisors take turns crafting statements she never signed. But silence has a weight, and in the void, the world began to fill in the gaps. The first fracture came from a retired teacher. a woman named Judith Langley, who posted a short blog titled The Principal I Remember. It was about Christine's tenure as head of Lakeside Academy, an elite prep school tucked into the hills of upstate New York. In the post, Judith recalled how Christine had quietly denied enrollment to 3 black students over a single year, despite high scores and glowing recommendations. It was never outright, she wrote. She'd use words like not a good fit or not culturally aligned. We all knew what it meant. That post was shared 2,000 times in the first hour. Then came a former administrator who posted emails from 2016 showing Christine referring to a Latino staff member as a loud liability and recommending his transfer. Then came the parents, then the alumni, and then Noah. He didn't drop a statement. He didn't ask for attention. He simply posted one photograph, an old one, taken in a sun-drenched backyard, of a younger Christine with her arms stiffly around a boy, no older than 12. The caption read, "Sometimes silence grows teeth. I left not because I hated her. I left because I couldn't be like her." That one post broke the dam. Christine's perfectly composed image, the curated persona of grace and social poise, crumbled under its own denial. Not because she had screamed slurs or waved flags, but because her harm had always been engineered quietly, with smiles and soft words, in boardrooms and classrooms, where optics could be massaged and consequences sidestepped. Meanwhile, Shaq stayed off the air. He hadn't granted a single interview, hadn't tweeted a single thought. Instead, he boarded a modest flight to Chicago, not on a jet, but on an Eversky commercial flight, seated again in coach. This time, no one escorted him off. In fact, most didn't recognize him. Those who did offered soft nods, a few whispers of respect. He nodded back, nothing more. His destination wasn't a conference or a court. It was a place he had built with his own money, in a neighborhood where the world often turned away. A converted recreation center on the south side called the Flight Deck. A foundation he'd founded 5 years ago for underprivileged youth, offering education, creative outlets, and emotional mentorship. He arrived unannounced. Inside, a group of teens were gathered in a circle, some drawing, some arguing about beats, one quietly working on a robotics kit. When Shaq entered, heads turned. Not with awe, but recognition. The kind that comes from someone who had shown up before and was showing up again. He didn't start with a speech. He just sat down, and after a while he began to talk. "I got kicked off a plane last month," he said, almost casually. A few eyes widened. A few leaned in. Not 'cause I yelled. Not 'cause I did something wrong. Just 'cause I was big, and black, and there. That was it. Silence stretched across the room. One woman's fear weighed more than everything I'd built. And I built a lot. I played ball. I built businesses. I gave jobs. I mentored kids. I paid for funerals, scholarships, surgeries. I sat in rooms with presidents and teachers and janitors. But to her, I was still just someone she needed to move away from. He looked around the circle. "You ever feel like that?" Every head nodded. Slowly. Honestly. Shaq continued, voice low but full. "That's the part they don't tell you. That even when you do everything right, dress right, speak right, build the dream, climb the ladder, you can still get dragged down by someone's perception. And it hurts. It does. But you can't let it rewrite you." One boy, maybe 16, spoke up. "But how do you not get angry?" Shaq nodded. "You do. You get real angry. But the question is, what does that anger build?" He looked around the room again. "I got kicked off that flight. Then I walked into a boardroom. Signed a document. Took the company. Because I waited. I watched. I knew when to move." He stood then, tall and calm. "Don't let their fear become your story. Build your own. And when you're ready, take the room." Outside that room, the world was listening. A local news crew had followed Shaq's arrival and posted a short clip. Within hours it was everywhere. Not dramatic, just his voice, telling the truth, to kids who lived it every day. Christine watched the clip on her laptop, alone in a home that had once been loud with curated perfection. Her PR team had all but quit. Her husband, Franklin, was being edged out of the board. Even her lawyer had suggested a strategic retreat from public life. But it was Noah's words that kept echoing. "I couldn't be like her." She tried to call him that night. The number rang and rang. No answer. The world had turned. The mask she'd worn for decades had been peeled back. Not by attack, not by force, but by reflection. Shaq hadn't exposed her. He had shown himself. And the contrast was the exposure. The elevator climbed in steady silence, floor by floor, until the digital display flashed 42. Christine Mallory adjusted her blazer, tugged it at the shoulders, until the fabric smoothed perfectly across her frame. Her reflection in the elevator's mirrored walls didn't betray the chaos that had shadowed her for the past 2 weeks. She looked composed, polished, poised, exactly as she intended to be. That was Christine's power, not brute force, but practiced control. Her image had always been armor. When the doors opened, she stepped into the executive wing of Eversky's LA headquarters like she still belonged there. The staff behind the glass partitions offered clipped greetings or averted their eyes entirely. No one reached for a handshake. No one asked if she needed anything. But Christine chose not to see that. Instead, she walked with the stiff dignity of someone raised to believe discomfort was beneath her. A junior assistant led her through the frosted glass corridor and toward the conference room at the far end. No one told her who would be attending. No agenda had been sent. But Christine was convinced this was a formality, a well-meaning internal review that would conclude she was misunderstood, mishandled, perhaps a touch too vocal in an emotionally charged situation. She'd rehearsed the talking points in her head all night. I was nervous. I've been dealing with anxiety. There was never any malice. My husband has always supported inclusion. The double doors opened. She stepped inside and froze. At the head of the table sat Shaquille O'Neal. Silent, unblinking, larger than life, not just in size, but in presence. He didn't rise. He didn't nod. He didn't speak. Christine blinked once, twice, and summoned a nervous laugh. Well, this is awkward, she said, attempting levity. I didn't recognize you on the plane. You were dressed so casually. I didn't mean to. Shaq didn't move. The silence was deliberate, echoing off the polished surfaces of the boardroom. Beside him sat a legal counsel from Eversky's internal team, and on the other side Dana Lang, the company's CFO. Christine's smile faltered. Shaq finally leaned forward, slow and precise, and reached into a folder. From it he drew a document, 2 pages thick, bound by a single black clip. He placed it directly in front of Christine, then folded his hands on the table and sat back. The paper had no title. Christine hesitated. Then, reaching forward with practiced grace, she lifted it and began to read. Her eyes scanned quickly at first, and then slowed, paragraph by paragraph. Her posture straightened. Her breathing shallowed. The room was quiet enough to hear the soft clink of her silver bracelet, as her wrist began to tremble. The document was not an NDA, not a cease and desist. It was a proposed settlement agreement from Eversky Airlines, its board and its legal department, jointly reviewed and endorsed by its new majority shareholder. It detailed, in exacting language, a pattern of discriminatory conduct spanning years. Notes from prior HR investigations, testimonies from former employees, anonymous complaints that had once been buried, now unearthed and corroborated, the video footage from the flight, the audio transcripts, the social backlash, the financial toll. And at the center of it all, Christine Mallory. There were 2 options presented. Option A, a full public apology, written and delivered by Christine, approved in advance by Legal and Communications, a joint interview on a national broadcast platform, a financial contribution from the Mallory estate to Eversky's new equity and flight initiative, $5 million minimum, in return non-criminal indemnity, and limited damage control. Option B, a class action defamation lawsuit, filed by Eversky on behalf of all affected staff, crew, and the airline's public trust. Formal charges of negligence, targeted discrimination, reputational damage, and breach of contract ethics clauses. Civil discovery procedures would open every corner of her professional and personal history to media and court scrutiny. Christine dropped the pages onto the table, her voice barely audible. This is a witch hunt. Shaq's expression didn't change. Dana leaned forward, her voice even. This is a reckoning. Christine's laugh now was hollow. This is political. I'm being sacrificed to preserve a brand. No, Shaq said softly. You're being held accountable for decades of quiet harm. This isn't about the plane anymore. It's about the pattern. Christine stood abruptly, the chair scraping back, her body rigid with disbelief. I've built institutions, schools, charities, committees. My husband served this company for. Shaq raised a hand, palm out, calm but final. That legacy you talk about? It's written in how people remember your actions. Not your resume. Christine froze, her eyes darting between the faces in the room. No one met her gaze with pity. There was no outrage. No voices raised. Only the weight of consequence. Long denied. Now due. She sat again, more slowly this time, as if gravity had doubled. Her hands clenched in her lap. Her bracelet, the silver one etched with legacy, caught the morning light. And suddenly, it didn't feel like a badge. It felt like a brand. She whispered, "What if I don't agree?" Dana answered, "Then we see you in court, and the cameras will follow." Christine looked down. The words were there. All the ways out. All the truths she never thought would surface. And across from her, Shaq sat still. Not to threaten, but to remind her. This was the offer she never saw coming. The studio lights hummed overhead. Soft, even, warm. Built not to dazzle but to create calm. On the polished wood floor of the network's downtown New York set, cameras rolled in tight silence, catching every inch of the frame where Shaquille O'Neal sat still, hands folded loosely, his expression steady. There was no preamble, no entourage, no suit, just Shaq, dressed in a plain black crewneck, jeans, and his presence, the quiet kind that carried weight, not from volume, but from truth. Across from him, the host, veteran journalist Marion Dorsey, glanced once at her cards before setting them aside. This wasn't an interview driven by bullet points. This was a conversation that had been coming for weeks, maybe years, and now the country was watching. "We appreciate you joining us, Mr. O'Neal," she began gently. "You've had opportunities to speak before now. Why today?" Shaq didn't smile, but his eyes warmed. "Because I wasn't ready to be heard until I knew why I was speaking." Marion nodded. "Let's talk about the flight." The word flight carried more than altitude. It now evoked a viral moment. Millions had watched the video, dissected the hush of the whisper, debated the discomfort of perception. But Shaq didn't begin there. "I've flown commercial before. I do it every year. Not for the ticket price, that's not the point. I do it because I like to remember what it's like to move through the world, like everybody else, where you're not announced, not protected, just another soul in transit." I sat down, quiet window seat. A woman boarded, sat beside me, that's it. Marion leaned in slightly. "And when she asked the flight crew to remove you, I wasn't surprised," Shaq said simply. "Not because she looked like someone who hates, but because she looked like someone who's never had to confront how she sees." She used phrases like, "I don't feel safe," and "he's intimidating." I've heard those words before. They wear suits, they sit in meetings, they sign forms, but what they really mean is, "You make me face what I've never had to question." He paused. "It didn't matter that I've built schools, charities, helped rebuild homes, paid tuitions, saved lives. In that moment, I was too tall, too black, too present." The camera caught the silence that followed. Not awkward, just full. "But you stayed quiet," Marion noted. "You didn't call it out right then." Shaq nodded. "Because power doesn't always scream. Sometimes it listens, and then it moves." He reached slowly into his jacket pocket and placed something on the table between them. A folded copy of the clause he had signed weeks prior, the one that gave him controlling interest in Eversky Airlines. The one that turned whispers into decisions. "I had the power to bury her career, to fire everyone involved, to light the match, but that's not what leadership is. Real power doesn't punish, it exposes. It shows people who they are, and then lets the world decide what to do with it." The clip would go viral before the interview even ended. Marion's next question came softer. "What would you say to her, if she were watching right now?" Shaq took a breath. "I'd say I don't hate you. I don't wish harm on you. I want you to see what you did. Not to me but through me. Because if you could do it to someone with my platform, you've probably done it to a lot of people who didn't have one. And they couldn't speak. I'm speaking for them." Somewhere in a downtown hotel 2 time zones away, Christine Mallory watched on a flat screen in a room that was too bright and too quiet. She sat on the edge of a white leather couch, alone, wearing a robe that hung too loose on shoulders, that felt suddenly exposed. She clutched her bracelet, legacy, turning it again and again like it might answer for her. Shaq continued. "This isn't a black and white thing. This is a human thing. The plane wasn't about race until someone made it about race. It was about perception. And perception becomes power when systems don't challenge it." He leaned in just slightly. "I'm not the victim in this story. I'm the amplifier. The real victims are the folks who get pulled from job interviews, ignored in meetings, followed in stores, questioned for existing. I was lucky. I had a boardroom waiting for me. They've got nowhere to land. Marian's voice dropped to a whisper. Do you believe in redemption? Shaq looked at her, then past her as if into the lens, into the homes watching. I believe in accountability first, then redemption. You don't rebuild until you acknowledge what you've torn down. Christine Mallory has spent decades using soft language to build hard walls, but that wall cracked the day the world saw her whisper. I'm not here to cancel her. I'm here to show the blueprint of how we fix it. The next question came with no words, just a look. And Shaq understood. He sat back, exhaled, and sometimes people forget that giants don't rise by stepping on others. They rise because they lift people. The studio went still. There was no applause, no cue, just a beat of silence so full, it said more than any speech ever could. In that quiet, across millions of screens, something shifted. Shaq hadn't delivered a takedown. He had offered a challenge. Not to Christine, to everyone watching. And the country already on edge, already raw, leaned in. Because truth, when delivered with dignity, doesn't burn, it builds. The final meeting wasn't scheduled in a boardroom or a courtroom. It didn't happen beneath glass ceilings or surrounded by lawyers. It took place in a quiet, private corner of the Eversky Civic Outreach Pavilion in Chicago, a space far removed from executive towers and luxury lounges, tucked behind the main lobby where community meetings were sometimes held. There was no podium, no media presence, no phones allowed, just a square wooden table and 2 chairs. Shaquille O'Neal arrived first, dressed in his usual soft black sweatshirt and jeans, the same way he'd walked into schools, courts, and neighborhoods for years. No entourage, no armor, just presence. Across the room, sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long rectangles of light on the floor. Outside, students from a nearby public high school passed by the glass, laughing, unaware of the quiet reckoning unfolding inside. Christine Mallory walked in alone, slower than usual. Her sharp edges had dulled. She wore gray slacks and a white blouse, understated, her usual pearls gone. Her face was tired, not from lack of sleep, but from the weight of reflection. It had been 2 weeks since the broadcast, 2 weeks since the world heard Shaq speak with clarity and grace, forcing the country to ask itself hard questions. She had watched that interview 3 times, each time pausing it at different moments, not because she didn't understand, but because she did. She sat across from him, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Shaq finally broke the silence. Do you know why I asked you here? Christine looked down, fingers laced in her lap. Then up, because I didn't choose the lawsuit. Shaq nodded. That's part of it. She took a breath, the kind that prepared for things unsaid. I watched your interview. He didn't respond. I wasn't crying because it hurt me, she said slowly. I cried because I finally saw what I'd been protecting. Not myself, my illusion of who I thought I was. She blinked quickly, caught herself. I spent so many years thinking I was fair, thinking I judged people by character, by merit. But what I really did was curate my comfort. I stayed in rooms with people like me. I led schools where kids were expected to conform, not belong. I wrapped it all in good intentions, and that made it harder to see the harm. Shaq listened without reaction. His face wasn't stern or soft, just present. I'm not here to humiliate you, he said. That already happened. But you still have a choice. He reached into a manila folder and slid a document across the table, not legal in tone, but personal in impact. This is the redemption clause, he said. It's not company policy. It's something I created because I believe in course correction, not cancellation. Christine looked at the header, Eversky Legacy Grant Partnership Proposal. It outlined a community investment initiative, co-funded by the Mallory family estate and Eversky, that would establish anti-racism education programs, mentorship centers, and restorative learning spaces in 12 of the most underfunded urban districts in the country. It required her public participation, not a statement, but engagement. Speaking, listening, standing in rooms where her name had once closed doors, and instead using it to open them. Christine looked up, overwhelmed. I don't know if I deserve to be part of something like this. Shaq didn't flinch. You don't. Not yet. But that's not the point. This isn't about what you deserve. It's about what you do next. Her voice cracked. I didn't know I was that kind of person. Shaq's reply came quiet, but resolute. Most people don't. Until someone holds up the mirror. Christine stared at the document again. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. Not from fear, from reckoning. I don't want to sign this just to look like I'm fixing things, she said. I want to mean it. Shaq nodded once. Then mean it. And stay in it when it gets uncomfortable. The moment hung in the air, like a bridge made of silence. She finally took the pen and signed. Her signature wasn't confident, but it was intentional. She set the pen down, looked across at Shaq, and whispered, "Thank you." He shook his head. "Don't thank me, just do the work." As they stood, Christine extended her hand, not for a handshake, but as an offering. Shaq took it, briefly. There was no smile exchanged, no ceremonial closure, just a passing of something real between two people who had once stood on opposite ends of a chasm. Shaq turned to leave, but paused at the doorway. "You said you used to run schools," he said over his shoulder. Christine nodded. "Then you know this. The best way to teach is to let yourself be taught." She stood alone in the room for a long time after he left. Not in shame, but in recognition. Outside, the students had returned from lunch. A group gathered in front of a mural painted along the side of the pavilion. It was new. Bold. A black silhouette of a man, lifting a plane overhead, with children climbing onto its wings. Underneath it, the words "Lift others, fly further." Christine walked out into the sun, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel in control. She felt human. It wasn't forgiveness. It was the beginning of change. 12 months had passed. Not in silence, but in subtle, tangible shifts. Shifts that couldn't always be measured in headlines or hashtags, but in how people walked through spaces they once feared. How names once whispered became symbols of accountability, and how a flight that once carried prejudice had become the runway for progress. Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport looked the same at a glance. The glass still glinted gold in the mid-morning sun. Coffee still steamed from kiosk counters. Screens still flickered with flight numbers and updates. But there was something deeper in the air now. A rhythm, a softness. And at Gate 12, the change was undeniable. It began with the artwork. Large banners now framed the waiting area. Not advertisements, but educational visuals from Eversky's new Equity in Flight initiative. One featured a drawing of passengers holding hands across rows, with the phrase "Everyone deserves to fly without fear." Another showed portraits of flight attendants, pilots, and engineers of all races, ethnicities, and backgrounds, their faces proud, accompanied by the caption, "Bias has no boarding pass." Near the boarding desk, a digital monitor played a looping clip, not of safety instructions, but of community stories. One showed a classroom in Detroit, where Eversky funded a new anti-racism curriculum. Another cut to a mentorship program in Oakland. A brief segment even highlighted Christine Mallory, standing beside a group of teenage girls in Baltimore, talking about the importance of dismantling internalized bias, not from a pedestal, but from a place of humility. But no one gathered around the screen that morning. Their attention was drawn to something else. To him. Shaquille O'Neal stood just outside the edge of the terminal doors, duffel bag over his shoulder, wearing the same worn hoodie from a year ago. His stride was calm, purposeful, familiar. He wasn't here to check on systems or address a board. He had already done all that. This visit wasn't about power. It was about return. A gentle murmur rose among the passengers as he approached the gate, not loud or intrusive, but reverent. Some recognized him instantly. Others followed the energy and leaned in curiously. A few pulled out phones, hesitant, unsure if they should document the moment, or simply witness it. The gate agent, a young woman named Imani, offered a warm smile as he stepped up to the desk. "Mr. O'Neal," she said, checking the manifest with a subtle wink. "Or should I say just Shaq today?" He smiled. "Just a passenger," he said. She handed him his boarding pass. Seat 2A, window. Same as before, but this time the energy around it was different. There was no tension, no quiet whispers of coded discomfort, no tightened eyes watching his every move. Instead, there was ease, recognition, respect. He walked toward the row of seats beside the large window overlooking the tarmac. The same seat where, 1 year earlier, he had sat quietly, only to be stripped of dignity by a woman's fear. That moment was behind him now, not erased, but transformed. A mother nearby leaned down to her daughter and whispered, "That's him, baby. That's the man who changed the airline." Shaq heard it. He didn't turn, but his smile deepened. As he sat, the glass window framed a clear view of the plane outside. A newer model, sleeker, bearing the new Eversky logo designed after the incident. The design was subtle, a silhouette of outstretched wings shaped by many hands, a symbol of shared lift. Passengers filtered in slowly. A few nodded toward him. One older man placed a hand on his chest in acknowledgement and said, "Thank you." Another offered a handshake. Shaq received them all with quiet grace. Then came a teenager, no older than 14, headphones around his neck, a skateboard tucked under his arm. He sat 2 seats away, glancing sideways for a while before finally mustering the courage. "Hey," the boy said, tentative. "Are you the CEO?" Shaq turned to him, expression kind. "Not today," he replied. "I'm just a passenger." The teen grinned. "But you were, right? You own this place?" Shaq chuckled. "Sometimes the best way to lead is to sit in the seat where the problem started." The boy nodded slowly, like he was still processing the depth of that answer. A flight attendant passed by, paused, and returned moments later with a cup of tea. "Your favorite," she said warmly. "We remember." Shaq nodded his thanks. The intercom chimed. "We are now boarding Group A for Flight 704 to Washington, D.C. The same route. The same gate." Shaq rose, waited for a few elderly passengers to board first, then moved slowly toward the gate. But just before stepping onto the jet bridge, he turned around, not dramatically, just enough to take in the full view of the terminal, the posters, the people, the atmosphere. It wasn't perfect. Progress never was. But it was different. And that difference mattered. Because real change isn't loud. It's felt. It's the quiet in the room where fear used to live. The nod of a teenager who once thought people like him couldn't be in charge. The shift in a company that once silenced bias to now challenging it openly. Shaq stepped onto the plane, took his seat, 2A, and leaned back. No one asked him to move. No one whispered about his size. No one made him feel like a threat. He looked out the window. The engines hummed to life. The ground began to shift. The plane eased back from the gate. Gate 12, the place where perception once tried to clip his wings. A gentle voice came over the speaker system, different from a year ago. It was warm, thoughtful. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Eversky Flight 704 to Washington, D.C. We thank you for flying with us. And remember, every seat matters, every story flies." As the wheels lifted off the runway, Shaq closed his eyes, not in weariness, but in peace. Above the clouds, he wasn't a CEO. He wasn't a symbol. He was just a man, a passenger. And that, finally, was enough. If this story made you pause, reflect, or feel, then carry it forward. The next time you board a flight, enter a room, or witness silence where a voice is needed, remember who you are in the story. Not everyone wears power on their sleeve, but everyone holds the power to shift a culture. Change doesn't always start with a speech. Sometimes it starts with who you choose to see, and what you choose to stand for, even when you're just a passenger.